Welcome to Inside the Mask, the podcast where we cover off all your favorite horror movies with a true crime twist. With the theatrical resurgence of a classic gothic vampire and a more modern-day take on the Wolfman, I just couldn't resist covering my own all-time personal favorite Universal monster film, dating all the way back to 1954. It's the story of a group of researchers who, after a groundbreaking discovery deep in the Amazon jungle, find themselves in dire circumstances after becoming trapped and isolated at a remote dig site along the Amazon River. And as tempers begin to flare, members of the crew begin to turn up dead in violent and potentially suspicious circumstances. Is this the result of a reported lovers' quarrel amongst the crew? Or is it a classic case of cabin fever, the result of the crew being stranded on this waterbound prison? Or do you believe the often debated scientific research reports that were recovered from the actual scene, in that this crew may have actually fallen victim to an almost prehistoric creature of unknown origins? I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this is Creature from the Black Lagoon. It's the midst of a golden age in 1954, and in the sprawling jungles of the Amazon region of Manaus, a geology expedition team is about to make the discovery of a lifetime. Now, before we get too deep into the case coverage itself, it's important to note here, the majority of the facts and evidence presented in this bizarre investigation are taken from a variety of sources, namely that of recovered research files and reports from the various crime scenes on site, as well as witness statements from biologists and scientists who survived the tragedy that befell the crew of the Brazilian research vessel Rita. Now, many of these facts and observations will be reported as they were originally recorded, including those that might otherwise seem unbelievable or, quite frankly, improbable. Now, the initial Amazonian discovery comes at the hands of expedition leader Dr. Carl Maia, who at this point of time is leading a team of field researchers to study local marine wildlife, specifically that of a Devonian species of lungfish. During their otherwise routine expedition, Dr. Maia and two of his colleagues inadvertently unearth a shocking and seemingly ancient discovery from deep within the shorelines along the Amazon River. A fossilized and skeletal appendage, unlike anything science had yet seen, or, to be fair, has not been reproduced in the many years since the events, is discovered perfectly encased in what's determined to be centuries-old dirt samples along the shoreline itself. Now, photographic evidence as well as sketches recovered from research files showcase that this severed appendage, likely that of an arm or a hand, had biological markers of an amphibious creature, including the presence of webbed fingers. Strangely, however, this discovery also seems to exhibit features that seem almost human. There's what looks like an articulated wrist joint, as well as a forearm bone that would otherwise typically not be present in an underwater specimen. Markers also suggest that this fossil dates back potentially thousands of years, and Dr. Maia's own field notes theorize that it might have at some point washed up from the nearby river before becoming encased in the earth. The sample was transported to a nearby marine research facility in Brazil, where after undergoing inspection by a team of scientists, it's confirmed to be a find unlike any other science has ever seen, and that the rest of this skeletal fossil might actually still be encased in the dig site back in the Amazon. Now, at this point, largely due to the no doubt historical significance of the find, Carl Maia orders the excavation site to be secured by his two-man expedition crew, while they decide next steps in their potential further fossil recovery process. He theorizes that even if they can't find any more of the skeleton along the shoreline, the remainder of the fossil and remains may actually exist potentially further down the river, where the water runs deeper. The urgency behind exploring this region is further amplified to avoid not only compromising the dig sites, but also the potential of poachers or other research teams infringing on the area. This was, after all, considered to be a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. Now, these same concerns would prove to be deep-rooted in the case of the deaths of the crew members of the water-bound research vessel Rita, and it wouldn't be long before the first tragic crime scene would be discovered. The assembled research team that would take up home in the Steamboat Rita was comprised of various field experts and marine biologists. Now, recruited to lead the actual recovery expedition itself is ichthyologist Dr. David Reed, who, coincidentally at the time of the Black Lagoon incident, was actually visiting from his tenured position at the California Aquarium. Funding this Brazilian expedition is prominent investor and future victim Mark Williams, along with his colleague and field expert Dr. Edwin Thompson. And in addition to the aforementioned Dr. Maia, this crew is rounded out by local steamboat captain Lucas, along with two of his crewmates and future murder victims, who investigation revealed were actually biological brothers, identified in reports as only Z and Chico. And completing this research roster is the lone female crew member and also student researcher Kay Lawrence, who at the time of the incident was both David Reed's colleague and also his alleged romantic partner. Now, when this science crew, outfitted aboard the ragtag steamboat, the Rita, sets back out on the Amazon River, no doubt eager to make the scientific discovery of a lifetime, they instead first make another unexpected find, although this time it would prove to be the first in many tragic incidents to follow. Upon returning to the original shoreline dig site, the crew finds the mutilated remains of both attending male research assistants, identified as local workers Luis and Tomas, as well as the site itself in a state of complete destruction. Field notes recovered reveal that the bodies of these men seem to have been viciously mauled by what's assumed to be some kind of a local wildlife, theorized to be territorial jaguars that had been known to frequent the area in recent months. Now, experts, however, tend to conflict with these theories, as the wildlife would be unlikely to destroy the campsite itself, as was indicated in the original research files that were later obtained by authorities. Locals in the area would also later suggest that the site may have actually been pillaged by rival poachers, having burglarized and subsequently vandalized the grounds in an attempt to cover their own tracks. But the official records of the marine biologist crew would point to a far more unbelievable theory, one that would shake the scientific community and have conspiracy theorists still buzzing over 70 years after the case's conclusion. Now, in an understandably controversial move even for the time period, the crew of the Rita opts to continue their expedition further down the river, where Captain Lucas pilots the vessel to the now infamous location, known only by locals as the Black Lagoon. Now, this Black Lagoon was situated in an offshoot of the Amazon River itself and averaged about probably 25 feet or so down to the lagoon floor. The site itself had become a bit of a local urban legend in that it was said that it was considered to be an underwater paradise from which no living person had ever returned. Now, it's important to note here that despite the evidence in this case that we're discussing, there's actually no indicator whatsoever as to there being any kind of truth behind these local legends and claims. There's no documentation or supporting police reports indicating any missing persons that visited the area, and at least none that could be formally connected to the Black Lagoon case itself. So it's likely then that this is just a coincidence and that there's probably no actual connection to the Black Lagoon case. Now, the tragedy of the Rita research team began almost as soon as their voyage set out. The actual location of the Black Lagoon was a dead end and had only one way in or out, offering only one path of potential retreat had anything gone wrong. And as the deadly events of this expedition unfolded, the crew of the Rita would find themselves completely stranded in the lagoon, when this one way out became completely obstructed by fallen debris. According to the research logs, after an exhausting 8 days searching the nearby riverbanks, the initial hours of the recovery mission within the actual Black Lagoon were actually reasonably successful. Numerous soil and foliage samples were recorded on board, and according to log notes, the limestone deposits at the bottom of the lagoon did actually closely match that of the initial samples discovered by Dr. Maes and his crew up the river. Now, even more interestingly, subsequent testing and profiling of these new samples, including that of a claw or almost tooth-like specimen, reveals that unlike the previously discovered petrified appendage, these new samples might actually be more fresh than they are fossil. Now, again, it's important to note here that the following is the account of the surviving members of the research vessel Rita, and that there are actually more practical theories explaining some of the events that would follow, and we'll get to those eventually, but the statements taken from the surviving crew of the Black Lagoon expedition suggest that at some point during their quest, they encountered not fossilized remains, but instead an actual living specimen, allegedly somehow perfectly preserved within the confines of this lagoon itself. And to press pause here, it's true that there's actually no photographic or scientific evidence to actually support these, no doubt, wild claims. Even the logs and evidence that were recovered from on board the Rita, which actually do include some photographs, don't actually show any clear depiction of this living specimen itself. Now, critics of the expedition and the subsequent claims chalk all of these reports up as nothing more than sensationalism, probably used in an attempt to drum up funding for further expeditions in the area. And as we'll get to shortly, other theories possibly indicate that it may have been an attempt to cover up an actual series of murders that might have taken place on board the ship at the hands of one of the crew. However, all theories aside, these surviving crew members never actually reversed their claims on the incident, in that they did in fact encounter some kind of creature on board that was detailed in both victim statements as well as research confiscated as evidence. The science team on board the vessel details that at some point they managed to capture and contain the creature on board, using a series of chemical tranquilizer agents that actually were recovered as evidence by authorities from the medical bay on board the science vessel itself. And while, as mentioned, no pictures exist, there actually were drawings and sketches included in the recovered files that seem to depict some sort of a gilled amphibian creature with almost humanoid elements, including scaled appendages, and that it allegedly had walked on 2 feet. Ultimately, though, the existence of this gill man is still the subject of much debate among experts in the scientific community. Either way, the deaths on board the Steamboat Rita and the disappearance of some of the crew cannot be debated. The first crew members to fall victim, whether it was to the gill man that was reported or otherwise, were 2 of Captain Lucas's own crewmen. At some point during the doomed expedition, longtime Rita crew member Chico goes missing. There are no witnesses to his disappearance. He just seemingly vanished from on board the ship. And even more suspicious, his own biological brother Z, also serving as crewmate on board the Rita, was found murdered on a nearby beach. Now, interviews with the science crew seem to suggest that both men were possibly killed by the creature in question, but other experts argue that this might not have been the case, and that instead, these 2 men may have been innocent bystanders simply caught up in a case of murder, and they might have seen too much. And the tragedy in the Black Lagoon would not end there. In what appears to be some kind of an accident during the aforementioned captivity of this prehistoric animal, captain's log indicate that the creature somehow broke free of its confinement on board. The ensuing chaos on the ship would somehow result in the severe injury of victim Dr. Edwin Thompson, who during what seems to be some kind of an altercation, suffered from horrific burns to his face, seemingly from some kind of an explosion from a kerosene lamp on board. He was treated and isolated by the surviving crew and, despite all odds, managed to miraculously survive the ordeal, albeit with extensive bodily trauma. And due to his survival, Edwin Thompson was able to provide a statement that may actually support the theory that suggests that the culprits in the Black Lagoon case might have been human after all, and we'll get to those supportive statements shortly. The final victim in the tragic deaths of the Black Lagoon expedition crew is none other than prominent scientist and investor Dr. Mark Williams. Now, according to survivors, Mark had attempted to retrieve this creature for capture and transport, allegedly unwilling to lose out on his investment and potential scientific find of the century. He pursued the creature down into the depths of the lagoon, and he reportedly did so alone. His body was ultimately found adrift in the lagoon itself, seeming to have been the victim of a drowning, despite being found with his oxygen tank and diving equipment nearby. It's suggested by investigators that he may have suffered some kind of an equipment malfunction, resulting in his tragic and untimely death. Though, interestingly, subsequent autopsy on Mark's body would reveal another, potentially interesting piece of information. Autopsy reports showcase bruising lesions as well as hairline fractures to Mark's own skull, indicating that his head suffered some kind of pressure-based or blunt force trauma leading up to his eventual death. Now, it might seem understandable to credit this damage to the pressures of the depths of the Black Lagoon, as depth pressure is sometimes known to cause implosion damage at great lengths. However, geographic measurements of the lagoon itself indicate that it was nowhere near deep enough to cause this kind of damage, especially not to such dense matter as human bone. It may ultimately be inconsequential. Again, the official cause of Mark's death is due to water in the lungs, ergo he drowned. But the evidence presented during autopsy is certainly interesting and may actually support theories that Mark may have actually been the victim of murder. Now, to dive into this theory, the creature from the Black Lagoon was never actually recovered by responding authorities or in further scientific expeditions to the area. Its existence is heavily debated and doubted by the scientific community, most of whom suggest that the initially discovered fossilized remains are likely from some kind of a prehistoric animal that couldn't have possibly survived such a long period of evolution in this remote part of the Amazon jungle. Most believe that the accounts of the crew are, as mentioned, nothing more than simple spectacle, and some even go as far to theorize a potential cover-up by the science crew that survived, possibly the result of a murder that may have been motivated by a simple lover's quarrel. Now, being that the amphibious specimen was never recovered, in spite of extensive efforts from the scientific community, many have questioned whether or not this story was fabricated completely and instead used as a means to cover up an otherwise very human case of murder. Now, to press pause, statements from survivor Edwin Thompson indicate that there was some serious tensions on board the Rita, specifically between that of colleagues David Reed and victim Mark Williams. Now, this included a very physical altercation that Thompson had witnessed while recovering from his burn wounds below deck, wherein David Reed was seen physically assaulting Mark Williams over some kind of disagreement, allegedly shortly before Mark would be discovered dead. And if you believe the gossip, this feud may have actually been the result of a shared interest in young female researcher Kay Lawrence, who had been in a romantic relationship with David Reed for at least a period of 6 months. It's even suggested that David Reed had developed a potential jealousy and disdain for his superior, and that this tumultuous relationship dynamic may have actually boiled over, pushing David to murder his superior, theorized to have been the result of possible blood and force trauma, given the damage to Mark Williams' skull discovered during his autopsy. It's possible then that his drowning was staged, and if true, that this Gillman story was simply made up, a ruse to cover the either accidental or quite intentional murder of this otherwise innocent member of the scientific crew. And while ultimately unclear, many suggest that his then partner Kay Williams may have also served as an accomplice in the raving story that appears in official reports, no doubt in an attempt to clear her romantic partner in any kind of wrongdoing. And in terms of the hired Captain Lucas, who was the pilot of the Rita, it's also possible that he was paid in part for his silence, and that quite possibly his aforementioned 2 crew hands may have been innocent casualties of these murderous events, perhaps having seen too much to have been left alive, and being staged and disposed of accordingly. However, again, this is pure speculation and a theory offered by those who tend to rationalize the otherwise bizarre events at the Black Lagoon. In official reports given by surviving duo David Reed and Kay Lawrence, they indicate that along with Captain Lucas and lead Dr. Maea, the remaining crew had an altercation with the creature, wherein they tracked its whereabouts back to some kind of an underwater cavern that was hidden in the depths of the lagoon itself. And during this almost cinematic encounter, the creature was killed by extensive gunfire at the hands of the survivors. The science crew was ultimately unable to explain the fact that this creature couldn't be located. While, once again, none of the fantastical stories presented can be confirmed, there were no charges laid in the case itself, including any sort of criminal negligence charges, which, to be honest, there might have been a case for either way, especially at the hands of Captain Lucas. And upon the official conclusion of the investigation, the true events that happened in the Black Lagoon within the Amazon jungle are known only to those surviving members of the steamboat vessel Rita. And other than the fossilized appendage originally recovered from the river expedition site, the existence of this alleged gillman, whether hoax or scientific anomaly, remains one of marine biology's greatest mysteries to this day, over 70 years after the fact. Thanks for listening to our true crime spin on Creature from the Black Lagoon. This is not only my favorite Universal monster movie, but also happens to be one of my favorite films of all time, really. I'm gonna be honest that I'm kind of a sucker for the oldies, but also I love the story, and the idea of a prehistoric creature existing in this pocket of the real-life unexplored Amazon is such a cool idea to me. Additionally, the implied tragedy of the Gillman, that while he's a monster, he's also just a territorial creature that's taken by the beauty beauty of the female lead in the movie is a great concept, kind of like Beauty and the Beast, that's both suggested and yet not also explicitly stated in the film. Also, the effects for the time were pretty dynamite. I really love the mask and the outfit of the Gill Man, and it's such an iconic look that's really kind of stood the test of time. There's some really creepy shots in there where the Gill Man is sitting in his cage underwater, and he's kind of just staring out with these dead eyes as his gills open and close. It's really stuck with me over the years, and I consider it to be one of the best use of practical effects at the time. Being that the movie was originally shot in 3D and is actually still available in that format in certain iterations, also adds to the intrigue of the movie to me. A few sequels were produced, but I've admittedly never seen them in their entirety, and numerous times throughout the years there's been talks of a reboot, including from studios like Blumhouse and even from Guillermo del Toro and apparently John Carpenter, though none of these have actually gotten off the ground at this point. It's something that I've never really understood about the creature from the Black Lagoon itself. I mean, we have like 6 million iterations of Dracula, there's tons of werewolf and wolfman adaptations, Frankenstein gets remade all the time, and I mean, it's pretty hard to top the remake of The Mummy with Brendan Fraser. I mean, that's cinematic gold. And even The Invisible Man has had his own fair share of remakes and alternate interpretations of his story. But for whatever reason, the creature from the Black Lagoon has never really received that kind of remake treatment, despite having what I consider to be one of the most original designs, as well as one of the most interesting stories and locations in the Universal Monsters lineup. Maybe the success of the newer Universal reboots like Invisible Man and Wolfman can change that, but for now, I just gotta rewatch the OG, I guess. My poor little Gill Man not getting any love. Come on, modern studios. And that's all for today's episode. Next week, we'll be diving into a franchise that I've been wanting to cover for quite some time. Just been kind of waiting for all the puzzle pieces to fall into place. We'll get to that next Tuesday. But as always, I'm your host, Evan Taggart, and this has been Inside the Mask.